Hello and welcome to U.S. History 215 Online. We are on chapter 20 this week. It is called Becoming a World Power. We're going to try the PowerPoint and video lecture together. We're going to try it again. It is kind of a skimpy PowerPoint, but I think, pictures really add to it for those who are visual learners. So our learning outcomes first are explain the major reasons for the growing call in the late 1800s for the United States to develop an empire. Describe the first moves Americans made toward empire. Explain the major reasons for the Spanish-American War of 1898. And discuss the controversy over imperialism that developed after the war. Describe the growth of imperialism in America during the Progressive Era. And discuss World War I, including reasons for the war, American experiences during the war, and effects of the treaty that ended the war. Okay, so I'm going to pop me over here to the corner. Okay, we're not quite to really talking about colonialism, World War I, and the Great Depression. And we aren't quite to Hawaii's queen, but we will get there, and she is beautiful. She is beautiful. Interesting story too. Okay, so Frederick Jackson Turner is a very famous U.S. historian, and he wrote this piece called The Frontier. Okay, so he wrote about the frontier and Frederick Jackson Turner's essay, The Frontier Essay. And in that, he really kind of reiterated some ideologies of America that were not particularly true ideologies. Between 1867 and 1917, the United States became a true world power for the first time in history. It was a result of the Industrial Revolution, which we talked in the last chapter. The search for overseas markets, and the ideology of manifest destiny. And manifest destiny is super important. Okay, it isn't listed here, but it does talk about it in your chapter. It held the belief that God had preordained that Americans would possess all the land between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, and which Americans had developed and conquering in the West in the 1840s, spurred the U.S. to keep pushing outward, building upward in Navy in the 1880s, and beginning to acquire overseas territories. Many Americans felt so they had a duty to civilize, which that word is very problematic, the so-called lesser nations of the world. Their superiority based in no small part on notions of racial superiority. And the victory in the Spanish-American War in 1898 was a turning point. Adding a string of island colonies of the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean to the U.S. territory, and declaring to the world that the U.S. was a global power. Okay, so we have to look at this manifest destiny that, this Christian God said that white Americans, this is very Eurocentric, this is very ethnocentric, this is very arrogant, that God said that they could have between sea to shining sea, that was his mandate. And interestingly enough, and I know you're not going to believe this, but that is not in the Bible. So I'm not really sure how they twisted or used biblical references, their superiority of their thought of religion, but that is not, it's not a biblical reference, it's not a biblical theme, it's not a biblical thing to take over necessarily. So that is really problematic, and it just really began the roots of racism in our country, which really is not the message if you look at the biblical message. Okay, during the years, American military might backed up the American commercial interest, and they had economic imperialism, kind of a takeover economically. This was a new kind of imperialism where they were kind of taking the dollar and not really listening to the countries and what they wanted independently, whether it's economic or independently, whether it's political. Why an American empire? While notions of racial superiority justified Ooh, when you see the word justified in history, you just need to pause a moment. Americans' expansionist position. America's creation of an overseas empire during the half-century following the Civil War was driven by four basic reasons: the closing of the American frontier, economics, religious and moral reasons, and geopolitics. Okay, Manifest Destiny and the end of the frontier. Again, we talked about this great historian Turner, and in history, he is well known. Okay, so that's why we are talking to you about him, mentioning him in your book several times. He said that the frontier was so integral to the nation's psyche that Americans might require a new frontier to ensure their survival, which he was pushing that they needed a new field, a wider field to exercise their rights. So take over more land from people that it doesn't belong to you. The Turner thesis, you have the definition here. It says, argument put forward by historian Frederick Jackson Turner that the presence of the Western frontier had shaped the American character and allowed the development of democracy and capitalism, necessitating, in the wake of its 1893 disappearance, a wider field for its exercise was used to buttress attempts to propel American interests abroad. Financial reasons, they wanted to create more markets. So having an empire, taking over islands, they felt that they needed to do that. Even though democracy is not taking over, it's giving people the right to vote. It's not a takeover. So this imperial view is directly opposing what the country was built on. Religious and moral reasons, they really believed Christianity in Western society was the pinnacle of civilization. So they really felt that their religion was better than everybody else's. And so therefore they would change or they would take their land. They would change or they would change their civilization. They would throw their culture away. Really very sad. That's why I like Cyrus the Great so much. I know I hate to go back to Cyrus the Great in Persia, ancient Persia, but he was amazing. First day he takes over the empire, boom, he sets the slaves free. Then he allows people to worship as they wish, and then he does not get rid of all of their culture. He says, show me the best of your reading. Show me the best of your poetry, your art, and I will show you Persia's best. And he brought all the best to his best ideas to his palace and had different things painted on the wall and that sort of thing. And he had a respect for other cultures. And I think this is super important as we study history. This ethnocentrism is dangerous because saying that mine is the best, I could definitely, in my arrogance, miss out on another culture's amazing, fantastic discoveries. Okay. Geopolitical reasons, beginnings, Pacific acquisitions. Okay, American businessmen wanted to get into the Chinese market. Now this is super crazy. Okay, China didn't really trade with anyone other than its tributaries. So it would trade with Vietnam, it would trade with Japan, all these different countries that paid them tributes. They weren't tributaries; they were paying them tributes. So if you wanted to trade with China, you had to go through them. That is their custom. That's their culture. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just different than ours. So lots of European, Eurocentric forces, the US wanted to break into that. The only thing China really wanted, it didn't need anything. Pretty self-sufficient, pretty happy. The only thing that China really wanted was silver. Okay, and they got a lot of silver from the Spanish silver mines and trading. That's all they wanted. If you don't have silver, they don't want it. So take your stuff and see you later, which is their right. Okay, so you have this pushing and pulling against China to open up their trade because they want that money. They want that, make that money with them, and all kinds of terrible things happen and instigated by the Europeans. There's a lot of countries in this world, and I love America. Please don't think I don't love America. I love America. I'm so thankful for it. But there's a lot of countries in this world that the US has treated very terrible, and they have a very good reason to hate our freaking guts, okay? And we need to just address that. We just need to embrace it. We need to understand it. We need to try not to repeat it. And that's why, you know, one of your words is patriotic history, because you can take all the good things about a country and ignore the bad. But then you could never change the bad. So you have to look at it completely and entirely as it truly is and embrace both the good and the bad of a country so that you can have progress, and be more democratic, and democratization and equaling out, and a respect for all other cultures and other people. Okay. There were some different treaties. The Treaty of Wengjia, I'm probably saying it wrong, agreement between China and the United States, signed in 1844, opening several Chinese ports to American trade. And that was actually swindled, arm twisted, not pretty, okay? I'll tell you what, I had the most amazing Chinese professor at my university, and he was brilliant and interesting and amazing. And if I had to do it all over again, I would probably really focus on Chinese history, because it's fantastic. It gets a bad rap, it gets a bad name, but it's fantastic, absolutely fantastic history. Okay, I'll move on. They talk about Alaska, and here we have Hawaii. So we're going to take a look at the Queen in Hawaii. What an interesting thing happened here. Okay, so Hawaii. Since the 1850s, the independent kingdom of Hawaii had looked to the United States for protection against other colonial powers. But there were some businessmen, here we go, greedy capitalism, and you have to be careful, because capitalism can become very greedy if there aren't different restrictions placed upon it. Okay, so they wanted to transfer power from the Hawaiian monarchy to the legislature. So they had some different U.S. Tariffs. The queen, her name was Liliuokalani. Here she is pictured. She refused. And if you don't agree with the U.S., many times in history, they'll just take you over. So it's pretty much a lose-lose situation. And you become a puppet. So American rebels, with some aid of the troops from a U.S. Navy ship at Pearl Harbor, seized Queen and declared a provisional government under Sanford B. Doyle, an American lawyer. His cousin was the pineapple magnate, James Doyle. Do you see some sort of opposite interest going on here? I can't think of the word. What's the word? Anyway, seizing it to make money. But thankfully, someone had a conscience, President Grover Cleveland's administration, which considered this coup illegitimate and said no and gave it back. Okay, using Texas as a model, Dole's rebels remained in control of what they now call the Republic of Hawaii and continued to agitate the incorporation into the United States. Okay, again, Texas was taken. Okay. So anyway, Texas was taken from the Mexicans, and we never want to talk about that. But if you read into it, it truly is what happened, and Americans were asked not to be illegal immigrants. Isn't this hilarious? The real story of the history of Texas. And they would not listen, and they just kept going in droves and droves and droves and droves until they took it over. Okay. Latin America, the Navy buildup, the Spanish-American War was ignited by Spanish's heart treatment on Cuba. Cuba had a lot of sugar. Again, businessmen wanted that sugar money and wanted the market on sugar. You had yellow journalism cropping up, sensationalizing headlines and stories to sell more newspapers. So you weren't finding the truth. You have the all this different stuff is happening. Then you have a USS Maine, not sure if they're going to go to war, and then it blows up right next to Cuba, and they blame the Spanish. And actually, later on, we find out that it was not blown up. There was a fire, and it blew up on its own. So that's why you have to be very careful rushing into war if you find something like that out. American demands, there's a really fierce back and forth battle of, let Cuba be independent, don't let Cuba be independent, and this back and forth with the Philippines as well. And there were a lot of things done to Cuba wherewith it really granted our hatred. because we really acted like the friend of Cuba and then we turned our back on it. So it's just really interesting to make sure that you study more in depth. Okay, finish out the chapter. That's all we have time for. Thank you very much.